Hey guys, do you remember the year 2018?
And yet, for ray tracing, it just works. You're going to see reflections of the toolbox of the garage and the car in the garage. Everything just works. Global illumination just works. Ambient occlusion just works. The cars just work. Everything just works because ray tracing just works.
How many times was the Nvidia boss made fun of for that? I'd guess at least 1,337 times. And the funny thing is, he wasn't completely wrong. But let's start from the beginning. You probably gathered from the title. Today we're retesting the GeForce RTX 2080 Ti because we already tested it back in 2018. And we've done many benchmarks on this graphics card over the past 5.5 years. It was officially released on September 20th, 2018, and that's a heck of a lot of time. In contrast to the Titan, which we just retested and is 11 years old, this Turing architecture we're going to look at now is actually still relatively young, you could say. And in this regard, this graphics card has relatively good chances to perform well against current graphics cards in current games. And yep, without giving everything away, that's right, it did surprise me a bit how incredibly well this graphics card has aged over the past few years, and there are several reasons for that. Turing, the RTX 2000 generation, is definitely a major point of contention as it was released in the fall of 2018 with an incredibly massive fanfare. Nvidia promised nothing less than having completely reinvented graphics. Back then, everyone thought, you guys are crazy, reinventing graphics is totally over the top. Yes, you could say that. The issue was that Nvidia had built a very large graphics chip, equipped with countless features that, here and now, that is, in the games of 2018, went in, brought nothing, but were meant for the future. And the future was no longer just gaming, so the Pascal GTX 10 generation, which was celebrated a lot, was a very fast graphics card generation and still very useful today. Besides gaming, Pillar 1, there was now also the pillar of AI, which is all the rage nowadays, and ray tracing. These two pillars, AI and ray tracing, were more like pipe dreams in 2018 future music that no one could really grasp, and Nvidia tried to make it appealing to us all with cool tech demos and statements like, it just works. More on that in a bit. Large portions of the 754 square millimeter chip, so it was really a very big device back then, were dedicated to things that you didn't need in the present. Annoyingly, this graphics card was also outrageously expensive, as the RTX 2080 Ti launched as the Founders Edition for €1269. For comparison, the top model GTX 1080 Ti just a year earlier launched at €819. That means the new card was suddenly €500 more expensive. And then you naturally ask yourself, what's the point? Why should I invest in this if it doesn't benefit me? And back then, that was definitely a legitimate question. However, with my current measurements, I can now say it was definitely an investment in the future because the 2080 Ti holds up excellently nowadays. But why is it doing so well? Simply put, Nvidia had the right judge. The Turing architecture has exactly the stuff you need nowadays. And back in 2018, it wasn't necessarily foreseeable, but the chances were good. Important in this context is, Nvidia didn't invent ray tracing because the ideas of ray tracing are at least 50 years old. People were already talking about how to do it back in the 60s. Back then, there simply wasn't remotely the computing power. So back then, in the year 2018, it was already decided by the industry that ray tracing was the path to be followed in the coming years. That usually goes like this. The most important decisions are made in the DirectX committee. That is a committee with companies like Microsoft, of course, as the driving force behind Windows and DirectX, AMD, Nvidia, Intel, and others. And they then discuss what's next for their client, or the next big hype to be pushed. That gets decided there. And in this case, it was DirectX ray tracing in 2018. Nvidia has always been at the forefront when it comes to incorporating new technologies. In that sense, they wanted to give customers added value, and that's why Nvidia was the first to implement these cool ideas into hardware. And not in a half-hearted slapdash way, but they truly went all in as early as 2018. And I just mentioned that quite a lot of these transistors were used for various things that you don't really need now. Those things surely aimed at the future. And yes, that's why in 2018 these graphics cards launched at a high price with a relatively small performance gain compared to the previous generation. By the way, that was 35% from the 1080 Ti to the 2080 Ti. Many people wondered then, what's this nonsense about? Now with new benchmarks, I can say what it was for. The innovations in Turing are truly manifold. It was no longer just a rasterizing architecture, so an architecture that could calculate polygons, shaders, and textures very quickly, but had several completely new processing units, at least in gaming graphics cards. The first innovation is the ray tracing cores, or RT cores. These cores could already handle the new data structure for ray tracing in the RTX 2000 generation, so process the BVH quickly and perform all intersection tests, that is, the tests to see if a ray hits polygons, as quickly as possible in parallel. The second innovation is the so-called tensor cores, or the TCs. They were already in the Volta architecture, like in the Titan V, which came out in 2017 for a sleek 3,100 euros. That's probably why none of you used it for gaming, but it was a very interesting card technically. The tensor cores are matrix multiplication specialists, so things you don't normally need for gaming at all, but mainly for AI computations, like influencing, for example, machine learning. There's a lot going on with reduced precision, like FP16, INT8, so integer formats and so on. And these things were basically non-existent in gaming at the time, which brings up the question again of what to do with all this stuff. And back then, Nvidia already had the answer: DLSS. In 2018, DLSS was still a paper tiger. You didn't see it outside of some tech demos. And for the first 2 years, DLSS was unfortunately pretty much garbage too. I'm sorry, but we have to admit that. Though the idea behind it was pretty cool and visionary. You could simply reduce the resolution and still get a pretty picture through clever data recycling, massively boosting performance. Well, since DLSS back then didn't use the tensor cores like it was supposed to, didn't produce a pretty picture, and didn't work with every resolution, it wasn't, well, for the first 2 years it wasn't very popular, and rightfully so. Then in 2020, PAM. Finally, the overhaul, DLSS 2.0, made everything awesome, and that basically brings us to the present. More on that in a moment. Innovation 3 can be summarized as a package, that is, DirectX 12 Ultimate. That was also officially specified by Microsoft only 1.5 to 2 years later. That means this GPU was already ready for all the new features that were later officially announced as part of the DirectX feature set under Windows. And this includes things like mesh shaders, a completely new geometry pipeline, which by the way is being used for the first time in Alan Wake 2. And as far as I know, also in Unreal Engine 5. I'm not quite sure yet, that's why it's in parentheses. Additionally, there are things like variable rate shading. So, to save computing power, various parts of the image with low color contrast are calculated with less precision. And sampler feedback, which strikes a similar note. So it's about conserving memory. These features, however, are not yet widespread outside 3D Mark and are not that effective either. That's why it's nice to have "it'll surely come in the future." So let's sum it up: a ton of new features, which we weren't sure if they'd ever be included or when they'd be implemented. And with that, I can finally build a bridge to the present. They have now been integrated, and as you all know, DLSS is now available in at least 300 applications or games. In that sense, the present is now, and now we finally get to the benchmarks. End of 2018, the 2080 Ti was still what you wanted. It was the fastest graphics card, like I said, 35% over the 1080 Ti, which back then was still pretty fast. How fast do you think a 2080 Ti is in the current graphics card landscape? Not quite as fast anymore, as you can surely imagine. However, to visualize this a bit, I've set up a tech table here with the 2080 Ti in third place and 2 other 20 series cards next to it. And I have to briefly mention that because one of them appears in the benchmarks and I refer to it very often. Let's start all the way on the left. The Titan RTX, the absolute top model from Turing, was released back in December 2018. We had them briefly in the test, but unfortunately Nvidia couldn't provide us with a card, so no retest here. That's why I'll just mention this briefly, you can forget it right away. This is the full TU102. With maximum clock speed, maximum shaders, and a whopping 24 gigabytes of memory. Yes, back then, there was already a 24 gigabytes graphics card. The 4090 isn't the first to have that. Next to that, he's kind of my guest of honor. I set out to see exactly what Turing can do at its unique best, and I proudly achieved that with this fine device right here in front of me. This is the only 2080 Ti model with insanely super fast 16 GB transfer memory, so 16 GTs in total, or 8000 MHz if you want, an MSI RTX 2080 Ti Gaming Z Trio. Z, last letter of the alphabet, so it must be awesome. And that's what this card was. So, a few months before Ampere came out, in 2020, this device here arrived with very fast memory, decent cooling. You can see it's effectively a triple slot. 3 power boxes and a maximum of 330 watts power consumption. And with that, I have also managed to accomplish quite a lot here in the month of June 2024, a hand-carved voltage frequency curve for 2 GHz core clock. And yeah, that was quite a lot back then, and the memory could handle a whopping 18 gigatransfers per second, so essentially we're talking about GDDR6X level of performance, which was incredibly impressive at the time. And thus, this particular graphics card has an impressive memory transfer rate of 792 gigabytes per second. That's way more than the Titan RTX, and enormously more than a regular 2080 Ti. In this respect, I just called this card the 2080 Ultra. This graphics card is not available in stores, of course, but you can clearly see what the maximum you can get with such a high-end GPU in benchmarks is. Before I bore you to death, let's finally get to the benchmarks, because I'm comparing a 5.5-year-old graphics card, which is really old for a GPU, with current models. And by current, I mean, for example, a 4090, so you can see the final winding. And I just mentioned it, the 2080 Ti is there twice, once as the Founders Edition with 260 watts, so that's how they released it at that time to the public. This basically illustrates a moderately cooled 2080 Ti with OC. And then this thick one here, which I've called Ultra, my modified version, with a proud 2 GHz and 18 gigatransfers. It still only has 11 gigabytes, which was a lot in 2018, and is okay nowadays. Let's dive right in with the benchmark breaker, Alan Wake 2. Definitely a great GPU killer, and in this case, also name-wise pretty cool because, fun fact, the architecture is called Turing, and the guy it's named after is Alan Turing. He was responsible for decoding the Nazi Enigma codes, but that's just a side note in his career. Alan Turing meets Alan Wake. And we can clearly see the 2080 Ti is quite obviously having significant issues running this brutally demanding game smoothly for the graphics card, which pushes it to its absolute limits and beyond. By default, the chart shows WQHD, and we see the 2080 Ti getting 28.6 average FPS. Not so great. However, I can show what happens in Full HD. There are clearly noticeable differences. After all, it's 38 FPS, so it actually works quite well, especially if you look at the other cards located nearby. These are cards like the 3070 and the 4060 Ti. Not actually that slow, honestly, but remember that is a former high-end graphics card. It gets quite exciting when you shift your gaze to the second highlighted card, and that's the 2080 Ultra, a truly remarkable piece of technology, which is my Max OC card. And here you can see a clear FPS gain, in this case, an impressive 19%. Accordingly, this particular card is really maxed out power-wise. Runs at a good 300 watts in this case, and here you see performance gain 19%, resulting in 34 average FPS, thus making this card even faster than a 68 XT and almost exactly at the same level as the RTX 4070. Respectable performance for such an ancient graphics card, you have to admit. As always, feel free to click the article below. All benchmarks will be there permanently. You could go over this for hours. I'm just doing it briefly now, otherwise this video will probably be 3 hours long. Some will listen, most probably won't. So let's take a brief look here at what happened in A Plague Tale Requiem. That's a game power intensive. A quick detour into the world of manufacturing, perhaps. Turing was manufactured back then in a modified 16 nanometer process at TSMC, so an adapted process. Nvidia called it 12FFN back then, but in the end, it was just, as I said, optimized 16 nanometer. That's why the chip was big, and while it was relatively energy efficient, it was still very cheap to produce, making it very popular among tech companies. And that is why it is incredibly important to undervolt this specific graphics card. And by manually tuning this graphics card using the voltage frequency curve, setting the lowest possible voltage, it indeed scales very well. Here we have another increase of 18%. And in this case, a jump from almost 55 to 64 FPS. And that is definitely very playable. And we are talking about WQHD here. So no Tetris resolution with giant pixels, just the modern resolutions that people actually want today. Since I'm not clicking through all the games, I'll touch on what's going well or not so well. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 is kind of an issue. It runs relatively poorly on Turing, and it also runs relatively poorly on the successor architecture, Ampere or RTX 3000. You can see what happens then. A 2080 Ti ends up not really far from an Arc A770 or RTX 4060. Normally, it would be a lot more, so in most other games, it ends up way higher. And that doesn't change much, even if you hit the card with a club as hard as you can. Though it's slower than a 76 XT with 300 watts and 2 GHz, which should offer better performance. It's a whole different story when you take a look at Counter-Strike 2. You might want to check out the video on the topic. We compared Counter-Strike 2 and Call of Duty as the AMD game versus the Nvidia game, because they often run significantly better on their respective architectures. And then you see something happening with CS2, which is completely unimaginable with Call of Duty. The 2080 Ultra, which is basically the fast 2080 Ti, nearly reaches the level of the 68 XT here, and that came out in 2020, as is well known, so it's much newer and significantly more powerful in most games. But as I said, there are cases where this old graphics card can still compete at a high level. Let's take a look at what's available in the Unreal Engine 5. In this case, Immortals of Avium, so with software Lumen. And there you can see this might not exactly be Turing's finest hour, but this old graphics card is still holding up pretty well. We see performance roughly at the level of the 3070 or rather the 4060 Ti. But it also means not much faster than a 76 XT or slower than a 67 XT. So it's not spectacular, however you can definitely still play with it, especially since you can also enable DLSS. To wrap it up, here's where the card falls flat, as they say. Starfield. Starfield, despite multiple patches where at least RTX 4000 has really gained, still tends to be an AMD game. And there you can also see the old Nvidia architectures like Ampere and Turing perform very poorly. We see here the 2080 Ti is the second to last card of the displayed models. so it's only slightly faster than a 4060, and it's not much fun with less than 30 FPS. And even a massive overclock doesn't help, because you'd need to overclock the card by 30% to see noticeable gains. Let's take a look at what comes out in the overall index, because that's sure to be the most exciting thing for most people. We see the 2080 Ti now lands here in the lower middle field. So in 2018 it was at the top, now with 37.7 total index points. And yeah, it's not really surprising, because normally it's always like that with each generation, the former high-end moves down a bit. And in this case, 37.7 is still a respectable value, because looking at the neighborhood, it holds up. As we can see, then as now the 2080 Ti is a bit faster than the RTX 3070. This one, 3%, yeah, that's alright, and it's noticeably also faster than an RTX 4060 Ti. So you have to let go of the idea that you'll somehow get into the range of a 4070. That's not possible with rasterizing. The same applies when you really push the 2080 Ti to its limits, and maybe even clock it all the way up to 2.1 GHz. That does sometimes work with this card. I still tested it with 2, just to make it run more efficiently and to show you some cooler numbers later. We see a moderate performance boost from overclocking by 15%. That's also pretty linear with the core clock. And by the way, the memory transfer rate on this card is a whopping 28% higher than on the reference Ti. And that is particularly evident in high resolutions. I can show you that quickly. The Ultra HD index is always a bit different from the overall index, because it reveals things like memory transfer rate and also memory shortage. Memory shortage doesn't happen with the 11 GB card here, but it does with 8. And you can see a correspondingly changed placement. The 2080 Ti is a bit stronger than the RTX 3070, which is slightly held back by the memory limit in UHD. And the overclocked card can outperform the standard card by an impressive 17%. And it is almost there. I don't really want to say it's the knockout distance, but it's still not quite there yet. The 4070 is only 8% faster than the 2080 Ultra, and that surprised me a little, because that's crazy. This card performs excellently at high resolutions because it has unlimited storage bandwidth and gets utilized better. While the 4070, being a cut-down model, struggles with higher resolutions, the cache overflows and so on, the memory bandwidth isn't abundant. Short interim conclusion, rasterizing, a brutally tuned high-end card from 2018 almost matches the mid-range of 2023 in rasterizing. Now let's move on to the really exciting part, the future, at least from a Turing perspective. In 2018, as I said, ray tracing was still a quiet vision of the future, and now it's 2024 and the games I'm testing are brutal. So you really need everything that a ray tracing architecture should be capable of. And this applies to both old and new GPUs. So this consideration is particularly exciting now, because we are no longer relying on just one pillar, namely rasterizing performance, but also AI, specifically DLSS, and the ray tracing units from Turing. Let's fully test them for the first time and see if these ancient units can still keep up. Let's keep it brief. Yes, they can. And that's because, as I mentioned at the beginning, Nvidia didn't just say back then, yeah, we're adding it as a checklist feature, the card can do ray tracing. Haha, we can advertise that on the package. But they were serious about it, even back then. Data structuring is accelerated, the work is done in parallel. In that sense, this GPU was really poised to represent the future back then. I know, this sounds sponsored by Nvidia. I'm already stroking my money case here. No, I also had big doubts back then. To be honest, in 2018, I just thought, what's all this nonsense? I'd also like rasterizing performance as ray tracing can't be used. 5.5 years later, it's completely different. This graphics card can render ray tracing, and it can even do it smoothly with DLSS. That was impossible to foresee in this form 5 years ago, but it has happened, and then you see impressive figures like the ones that come up here. This is Alan Wake 2. I'll switch to Full HD to make the values look a bit nicer for all graphics cards. Ray tracing, maximum DLSS quality, the 2080 Ti reaches 34 FPS. It's not super smooth, but a console often plays more and more frequently at 30 FPS. You can play on the PC with the pad. It's wonderfully playable and looks super cool. If you overclock this ancient graphics card to the max, you can even get up to 38 FPS. And here, the performance boost is limited, simply because the power limit doesn't rule. In that sense, the reference card can perform quite well. Yeah, so 38 FPS in Alan Wake 2 with ray tracing and DLSS quality, not bad at all, especially when you see the cards in the neighborhood. The 2080 Ti is almost as fast as a 7700 XT. It's faster than a 4060 Ti, and with overclocking, it nearly matches a 7800 XT, which now costs 500 euros new. Not bad at all. These good results are consistent across all tests, more or less, depending on how the game goes. However, Cyberpunk, for example, is also a game that, by the way, runs incredibly well with rasterization on Radiance, which is a little known fact, and only becomes Nvidia friendly with ray tracing. Simply based on the hardware, because this hardware is stronger at ray tracing. Looking here in Cyberpunk 2077, the 2080 Ti out of the box matches the performance of the 68XT, 34 FPS on the GeForce versus 33 on the Radeon. Both are really smooth though, as I said, respectable performance for this ancient graphics card. And if you tweak the card here with a club and pump it up to 2 GHz, you can achieve an average of 39 FPS. And we're still talking about WQHD, not Full HD. I can show you what happens with Full HD. Clearly much more friendly for the GPU. We have 52 FPS out of the box, and with OC enabled, 56 FPS. And that's definitely smoothly playable, especially since with such an old graphics card you probably don't want 120 FPS plus. Let's take another look at Desordre. It still remains, even though a lot of time has passed and several games have been released, one of the few games, I think there are 2, with hardware lumen. That means hardware accelerated ray tracing in Unreal Engine 5. And that, predictably, suits GeForce cards particularly well. And some very exciting things come out of it, namely, good frame rates on all graphics cards here in the middle. We now have on the 2080 in WQHD 50.6 FPS average, maximum details, ray tracing with DLSS quality. And thus, it's basically as fast as the 7900 GRE, which currently costs over 500 euros new. You have to nod in approval. And also here, for the sake of completeness, if you overclock the card, a maximum performance increase of 13%, 57 FPS average in WQHD. So here we go. Feel free to take a much closer look at it. I want to show you another detailed example where the 2080 Ti or Ultra doesn't perform all that great, especially in specific scenarios. Because the memory here is really bursting at the seams completely. It's true. So ray tracing requires more memory than rasterizing. Logical, because more data needs to be stored. In this case, with 11 GB, you can still manage quite well, up to and including WQHD resolutions. Beyond that, it can get tight. And you can see that in Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, among other things. That's not practical, because no one is likely to play that in UHD on a 5-year-old graphics card. However, I can show you, so I will do that. Here we see the starting point, the 4060 Ti with 16 GB. It's up here. It shows how it can go when the storage is enough, and I'm comparing it with the 8 GB version. It's down to just 19 FPS, so 19 to 38, factor 2, just because the memory is full. And you can also see that the 2080 Ti is not quite enough either. It has 11 GB. In this case, 21.9 FPS, and the heavily overclocked card can't really get ahead of the non-overclocked graphics card simply because the memory slows things down. And here we encounter a bottleneck that one wouldn't necessarily have expected in 2018, however, it does make sense. Many years later, those bottlenecks appear more often. PCI Express 3.0, Turing is based on PCI Express 3.0. With 16 lanes, however, it's half as fast as 4.0, which Ampere could or can do. And here you can see very well, the 3080, even though it only has 10 GB, is significantly faster than the 2080 Ultra, in this case by 34%. It also lacks memory, but it can copy data twice as fast from A to B, which is why it still reaches 32 FPS here. Let's take a look at the overall Raytracing-Index, because that's where all these things that you can only guess at come to light in the big picture. And that's actually a really quite interesting and surprising picture, which probably not everyone would have expected to see here. To be honest, I didn't expect this. We clearly see the 2080 Ti ahead of the 4060 Ti with 8 GB. And that's definitely due to the 8 GB card's memory. So Ada can't shine here because the memory isn't enough. How that can look is shown by the 16 GB version. But this card isn't actually my point to discuss with you. Rather the 68XT, which here is only 1% ahead of the 2080 Ti on average. Just a reminder, this graphics card came out in 2018 focusing on ray tracing. The 68XT came out at the end of 2020 without focusing on ray tracing. One always wonders why AMD cards aren't as fast in ray tracing. It's really because it was specifically designed to efficiently save transistors. So there's absolutely no RT cores that can accelerate the BVH data structure so they can process it. Instead, the texture units are enabled to perform the intersection tests, that is the ray tracing in space. And the problem is obvious. If I'm checking whether a ray hits a polygon, I can't simultaneously continue my work as a texture artist. That's why it's either or. It means if the ray tracing is a bit light, the AMD cards run pretty well. However, when things get complex, and that applies to the Raytracing-Index 2024, this concept simply reaches its limit. And that's similarly the case with RDNA 3. There are 2 instructions to speed up the whole thing. Therefore, RDNA 3 is faster per transistor than RDNA 2 in ray tracing, but not significantly. And thus, this ancient all-in architecture is as fast in ray tracing as the much newer and supposedly more powerful 68XT from AMD. This point is further emphasized by the overclocked 2080 Ti, and so naturally the Ultra is a key factor here. We see a performance increase of 12% and an index value of 40.2, making it significantly faster. And yes, that's certainly not fair. I'm comparing a heavily overclocked graphics card with a standard one, but just for the sake of completeness, with proper overclocking, meaning a contemporary clock rate, you do get to the performance of the current AMD mid-range in ray tracing. Now let's move on to my second favorite part. Actually, it's really the most exciting part of this observation because, again, jump back in time, in 2018, no one knew what to do with all these transistors. Nowadays, you know all the cool things that modern games do, like path tracing, ray reconstruction, and frame generation. I think now is the right time to finally explain what "it just works" has meant. "It just works" is pretty much the most famous quote besides
"The more you buy, the more you save"
from the Nvidia boss. He meant that if you implement ray tracing and don't optimize it to death, which is done constantly these days, it just works. That means I simulate light, my shadows fall correctly automatically, I have an accurate color transfer automatically, and it just doesn't work if you optimize all these things to such an extent so that you basically only have limited ray tracing. And you bypass this problem with path tracing, which is naturally optimized. Otherwise, it would run like a sack of coconuts. However, you really trace the rays to the end, and then you get the whole beautiful picture, which you can see right now in Alan Wake 2 or also in Cyberpunk 2077. Path tracing that works on Turing from 2018. However, as expected, not particularly great. The second, a feature that nobody knew about in 2018, that's ray reconstruction. Turing can do that too. So if you have an old Nvidia graphics card, you can enable ray reconstruction in current games and thus kind of balance out the side effects of optimizing ray tracing, leading to improved visual quality and performance in your gaming experience. It ensures a proper reconstruction of all the missing rays. It's basically an advanced denoising. And the clever part is, Nvidia has implemented it in such a way that ray reconstruction, on current GPUs at least, is cheaper than denoising, which often comes at least with higher computational costs. It's basically a win-win situation, but let's take a quick look at what the ancient Mr. Turing has to say when faced with path tracing and ray reconstruction. Here again, Alan Turing meets Alan Wake, and we truly see everything the game has to offer. Path tracing incorporating advanced ray reconstruction, however, with DLSS performance active. So WQHD with DLSS performance means internal 720p, and it still doesn't run that great. We see an average of 23 FPS. You don't want to play like that. It is still our super nasty scene in the forest where Nightingale haunts. And yes, most scenes do run at 30 FPS in the game. However, I'd say we can dismiss that. It's truly not very fun to play. However, it works on this 5.5-year-old GPU without issue. Not bad. Let's see how it looks in Cyberpunk 2077. And that's funny, because the average frame rate is almost the same. Back to Alan Wake briefly. 23.2, 23.1. So Cyberpunk runs with path tracing and everything, and sharp. Just like Alan Wake in our nasty scene. And yeah, you don't want to play it that way, so you can cross it off here too. Example 3, here again, Desordre, Unreal Engine 5. This game is truly a playground for tech enthusiasts, because you can also enable path tracing here. And that's really rare with Unreal Engine 5 normally, so you can enable it in the editor. Here it also works in the game, and there you can see a frame rate of 26.2 FPS average with DLSS performance. Despite the huge overclocking to 2 GHz. It's a relatively slow game, you can play it. However, it's not that great. So I'd say, let's just check that box. What would probably solve the problem is frame generation. However, DLSS frame generation supports only ADA, meaning RTX 4000. That means on a 2000 card you won't get it, on a 3000 card neither. In that sense, it would have been nice. However, that's the only thing Turing cannot do. What Turing can do though, and that's explicitly thanks to AMD, FSR frame generation, I wanted to show you again. Has nothing to do with ray reconstruction or path tracing, but Starfield offers FSR frame generation, and it runs wonderfully on such a Turing GPU within the actual possibilities, allowing you to experience breathtaking visuals and performance. Here it is the same, WQHD, but this time with native resolution, so the FSR native mode, and here you can see in this frame sequence, frame generation on and off. And you can see if you turn off FG, you get 26.4 FPS, so it's barely playable. And with FG on, you get 50.5. Yeah, you definitely notice a lag, but due to the approximately, about 90% higher frame rate, you can really tell it still looks significantly better. And through Reflex, which works with Turing as well, the lag gets compensated a bit. That means, in the end, it's definitely a win for playability, because having 50 FPS or not, why not? If Turing can do one thing, it's being future-proof. This is something we can really prove here. And yes, path tracing, ray reconstruction, both are there. Only frame generation the GPU can't do, but that can be forgiven, because the new Ampere GPUs can't do that either. Let's move on to energy efficiency. That is quite interesting as well. We're comparing a 5.5-year-old graphics card with a relatively outdated manufacturing process to current models, or at least newer models. And just as a reminder, here the Turing chip is manufactured, or was manufactured back then at TSMC in an adjusted 16 nanometer process. and 16 means Pascal was already made with 16 nanometers. In this case here, it's called FFN, so the process is actually a slightly reduced 16 nanometer process, but at its core, it's still relatively antiquated, and accordingly, the overall energy efficiency isn't all that great either. Here we see the rasterizing chart, and the 2080 Ti in the reference design with 260 watts board power is practically at the bottom. We see here second to last place with 0.145 index points per watt, not so good. Everything else is better. However, that's expected because that's life. Shrunk manufacturing usually means higher efficiency. What you also see though, and this is actually quite surprising in its extent, is that the 3080, which is a 2-year newer model, Ampere, back then manufactured by Samsung, has only 8% higher energy efficiency in rasterizing. This is probably new in its manifestation, I haven't seen it like this before. However, even back then, it was clear that Samsung's manufacturing wasn't top-notch. AMD had this advantage with the 6000 series. See it here compared to the 2080 Ti. The 68XT has a 21% higher energy efficiency, and that's not bad at all. Also surprising, at least I didn't expect it that way, is that the 2080 Ultra, the manually overclocked card, achieves nearly the same energy efficiency as the reference card. And that's due to my skill, you could say, but no, I got a bit lucky. That's a relatively good GPU, of course, made later with a better cooler. And it's like this. I set the voltage curve so that the least possible amount of voltage is used at 2 GHz to optimize performance. That means it's running relatively efficiently. It's not the sweet spot, but still pretty good. And that's why it comes out average board power of 300 watts. That means in some games, it needs less. In some cases, it requires the full 330 watts that this card can provide. And that's why the energy efficiency of the card is just as good, just like with the reference card. Normally, I say with ray tracing, the wind changes. However, in this case, it doesn't really turn except for one model. And that's really exciting again, because things come up that probably no one expected. I didn't expect them, at least. We see that the 2080 Ti in both versions, as a reference card and as a Max OC version, rises by 1 position, and that's because the 68XT has dropped all the way down. Let's briefly recall the performance index ray tracing. In this case, the 68XT is roughly 1% ahead of the 2080 Ti. However, it needs about 290 watts across all tests, while the 2080 Ti clocks in at 260 watts. And that's what we're seeing now. The 2080 Ti and the 68XT are equally fast. However, the old card is more efficient than the new one. Let's move on to the conclusion after 5.5 years of Turing. When this generation came out, the RTX 2000, there was a proverbial elephant in the room. What is this nonsense? Back then, nobody knew why Nvidia was spending so many transistors to invest in features that didn't even exist yet. Or they were planned, but they didn't appear in the games. The main problem with this situation was that the prices were set by Nvidia as if these features were already widely available. I told you at the beginning, the 2080 Ti started in 2018 as the Founders Edition, this reference card here, with a bit of OC for 1269 euros. That may sound relatively little today, but it was quite a lot in 2018 because the 1080 Ti, the previous card, started at 819 euros. And that's why everyone wondered what the nonsense was about. Now I can tell you, after these tests, the nonsense was totally worth it. How did this initially quiet music of the future evolve into a loud yet harmonious concert? And I would say it's a mix of a bit of luck, but also simply due to the fact that Nvidia has a huge market power, meaning a huge market share. They naturally want to work with developers and push technology forward. And they don't do this because they're such nice people, but of course to sell graphics cards, so to provide you with some added value. Let's briefly recall the problems. Ray tracing was widely touted by Nvidia, even featuring tech demos, but it was not remotely available in games. Battlefield 5 was initially a pure rasterizing game and only got ray tracing later. DLSS was, apart from a Final Fantasy 15 demo, something for the future, and unfortunately in the first games, so in the first 1.5 years, pretty rubbish. So DLSS in its first form wasn't good, had to be revised. Nvidia did so, but only in 2020. That means in the first 1.5 years it was a fast graphics card, but hopelessly overpriced and not really a benefit. But now, 5.5 years later, this graphics card has aged incredibly well. I'd even say it's one of the graphics cards that has aged the best so far. And by the way, I also hope you didn't sell your 2080 Ti back in late 2020, because Nvidia said the 3070 is faster. That's still the better graphics card because it has 11 gigabytes instead of 8, like the 3070, but I digress. Overall, one can say the investment was worth it. And that was like betting on a horse, a bit of a gamble. However, almost everything that Nvidia had initially envisioned has surprisingly come true here. And indeed, that's actually quite good news because it's fundamentally the antithesis to the Titan. We looked at that card a while back. 11 years ago, the Titan came out, and the features were more like, well, just about okay, but not suitable for the future. Here it was the complete opposite. Everything was geared towards the future, and as a result, it is a damn good graphics card in the present. And the moral of the story? Don't vilify future technology. You can really say it like that. So it's always a bit of a gamble, and many features that were introduced in the relatively young but dynamic IT history, yeah, not all of them have prevailed. However, quite a lot of them. I think it's just a nice example that in times where there's only hate and only negative things work, this graphics card has transformed from a grudging purchase. Anyone who bought it back then for a lot of money probably thought, what am I doing here? However, those who still use it see, wow, it was really worth it. The investment was worth it. This graphics card is definitely future-proof or, well, present-proof right now. So that's it for this retro review. But retro, when does something become retro? From 5 years on, that can be accepted. So that's the retro review. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to see more recaps, feel free to subscribe and like, and let me know which graphics cards you'd like to see retested. I'm thinking, for example, about the 1080 Ti or the Radeon 7. Then yes, we'll take a look at that, and you'll surely see new exciting videos from us soon. However, it will probably be about new graphics cards first. In that spirit, see you soon.